So finally, I've got an opportunity to interview you. With your tight schedules, with your meditation practices, with the work that you are doing. So thank you so much for agreeing to be here with me in this conversation. Such a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Gaurav. That's my pleasure. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to be here.
I remember our last conversation, and that conversation left me pondering on several questions, as simple as what's the nature of consciousness? When did I get into meditation? What happened in my life that I thought that coaching could be one area that I would like to explore? I revisited the deficiency needs of an individual. I revisited my own deficiency needs, my own being needs. So those are the questions that I kept pondering post our last conversation. And today I'm looking forward to this opportunity to explore this thing for myself and open this space for the audience as well, where they can explore these questions for themselves.
It was a lovely conversation. I wish we had recorded that one as well. And I felt that expansion in the conversation. So we clearly share a lot of values and vision and calling. So it was nice how we just attuned in that moment. So I look forward to this one today as well.
Looking forward, Timothy. Thank you so much. Let's begin. And this is one of my favorite questions. Also, it helps me to get to know a little bit about the person that I'm getting into conversation with. So let's start with if you can share a story from your life that brings a smile on your face today as well.
Yes, well, I think I'm going to go back to my mid-20s when I was really feeling this strong calling to challenge the existing leadership paradigm, organizational paradigm of the 21st century, which I know we'll talk more about. And on that journey, I had this calling to write a book, actually, several books. I could envision them. And in one of the very first book that I wrote, which was published in Turkey in Turkish nationally, the book is called Should I Become a Buddha or a CEO? That was essentially my existential question, a little bit of an early midlife crisis in mid-20s, so maybe 15 years earlier than kind of the average. But when I was pondering on that question, I started seeing a book cover, like I could visualize it. I got that book cover done, made, produced by a graphic designer friend. And I did something very risky with that idea of, again, law of attraction, but calling as well, that I started announcing that in 1 year, my book will be on the shelves nationally. Now, I'm not sure if I would do that again ever, but that of course, that gave me such a drive to write, finish, get published. At that time, I didn't even have a publisher. A very long story short, I tried writing a book, it didn't come out. And then I started tapping into some author friends, some publisher friends, and asking, how do writers write books? The insights I gathered were so valuable that alone that helped me write a book, not yet write the book, but I found a publisher and it got nationally published. So 1 year, 1 month later, my book was nationally published. But it was also speaking to that idea of finding that calling, that vision from inside out and making it a reality. Of course, it happened on its own, but it was a lovely process that still to this day gives a smile to my face. How did I ever do that? I announced to the whole world my book is going to be out there in a year.
Declare it and then learn how to swim.
Indeed.
You said something so beautiful. You said, how can we go deep within to find our own inspiration and purpose? And that's, in fact, that's one question that I wanted to ask you. And I will ask you in a while. But let me just take one step backwards so that we can get a clear understanding in your life. I remember very clearly you mentioned that you were introduced to the world of meditation and yoga at an age of 17. Tell me about that. How did you get initiated in that space?
Yes, the story would go back to the idea that I grew up in a household, definitely nowhere perfect, but one of the jewels my family offered me was that they were avid readers, and they were reading philosophy and religious books, and they read holy books. I remember my parents discussing when I was middle school, they would talk to each other saying, this story in this book is exactly similar to this story in this other book. And they were working toward this understanding of there's a universal idea behind this. There are connections of truth. So of course, being having that kind of conversations in my developmental phase have been really influential on me. And when I was 15, 16 years old, I dealt with anxiety and a little bit more on higher than average. And I wasn't happy with myself, how I was living life, how I was feeling. So I was curious about, how do I deal with emotions? How do I deal with these thoughts? What's happening to me? And who am I? So that search led me, with some friends' referrals. I went into a little bit of healing practices of Reiki, but around that same time, I was introduced back in Istanbul, Turkey, to Raja Yoga, to the Brahma Kumaris World Spiritual University, where I started learning about yoga, Raja Yoga specifically, but of course some other yogas. And I started practicing that. So I practiced Raja Yoga for around 10 years, which helped me cultivate an incredible amount of awareness, and probably that accelerated my kind of maybe growth in consciousness. And that's what I've been exploring since. So what happened during those formative years, 17 to 27, and how my idea of self transformed and developed and expanded. And I've been researching that ever since, while trying to help leaders of the world as well.
At an age of 17 to 27, where people are struggling, people literally struggle to find their own feet in the ground, people struggle to find who they are, and they are chasing recognition, they are chasing a sense of respect. When people are chasing a deep need for belonging, here you were who's saying that changed the concept of self.
Indeed, very well said. Yes.
And because you also spoke about consciousness and transformation. Now, here's my question, Timothy. How would you define self?
Now, a lot would define self as a concept, as a construct in our minds, but I would say self is an experience, that experience of who we are and how it's felt. And it's a fluid concept. I think the important thing that I can acknowledge, that it's the fluidity of the self and the facets of the self. So it's really multi-dimensional, multi-layered, a really complex construct. Yes, of course, we can try to simplify it, visualize it, put it in buckets, but the fluidity of self, that it's transformational, it's in growth. And also I kind of like distinguishing between self small lowercase s and self uppercase s, in terms of, do I feel limited to this identity, Timothy Tiryaki, name, history, and body alone? But we know that the self can also have feelings of expansion, being beyondness, and maybe that expansion is about family, maybe the country, maybe nation, maybe religion, or maybe the whole world, the land itself. So the idea that self actually can have an expansion is a good reminder for all of us.
I don't know, it's a coincidence or what is, I would call it serendipity. For the last 1 week, I've been contemplating about this concept called self, and also I've been contemplating what's the nature of consciousness. And I think this is just putting all the pieces together of the jigsaw. When you said that self is a concept, it's an experience, and it's an experience of fluidity. And if I were to bring my own 1 cent or 2 cents in this conversation, I believe that all of us would have a very different understanding and different concept of the self. So would it be fair assumption to make, Timothy, that self is an experience of fluidity that emerges from the consciousness that you're operating from? Would it be fair to say that?
That's a lovely definition. I love it. Yes. It's a function of the level of awareness we have. And based on that awareness changing, the experience of the self changes as well. I love that.
So beautiful. So beautiful. Thank you. Didn't I tell you that I love all my conversations with you?
Oh, thank you so much. Same on my side. And I'm inspired by your humbleness and humility in all these interviews. So.
Thank you so much. So let's take one step ahead, Timothy. You do a lot of work in the space of Maslow's hierarchies of needs. How did you get introduced to this Maslow's hierarchies of needs, and how relevant are they today when an individual's needs are changing, when people are experiencing different threats from different dimensions, and we are moving the 21st century?
So I'll start from obviously one of the first introductions for me was in university in Psychology 101. Although I'm an engineer by study, I haven't been a practicing engineer. And maybe I'll just tackle the story from that end first. And having taken Psychology 101, I was fascinated by that idea of human beings, which I started thinking about other dimensions of the human psychology, the psyche.
Hmm.
And towards my later years in university, I think it was the third year or so, I was going through this operations research exam. It was multiple pages of equations solving an airport optimization problem of trucks and devices and vehicles and number of people that the airport needed. And I was stuck, and I remember I had one of those moments, this moment of satori, a glimpse of like something else and maybe my truth. And I was kind of, why are we talking about the people? Like, are the people happy? Who are they? How are they working together? Are they collaborating? Who's leading them? Oh, leadership, like that could make such a big difference in efficiency or the number of devices, vehicles, and people we needed. I barely passed that exam, not because I didn't know how to do it, but I was stuck with this idea. And as engineers, why aren't we talking about the human facets at all? Well, obviously, I got to learn soon that I wasn't going to be a great engineer, and I moved into these different fields about human sciences and exploration of this area. So that
Probably.
was my first introduction to Maslow in university.
And one of those introductions, one of those moments where you realized that you love working with human beings. You are curious about human behavior.
Yes, indeed. I found that that was an area that we needed to explore more as human beings. And after I worked at some large corporations like Procter and Gamble and Intel, which were great role models on demonstrating being people focused as well, but noticing a lot of what's happening in the world and my calling, again, we all have different callings. That soul searching led me to understand that I can speak a language of large corporations, and these companies have huge influences on the world, on nature, on clients, consumers, lives, families, employees. So I decided that how can we bring this human aspect, this humanness into organizations further? So it took me years to clarify, kind of like be able to articulate that feeling inside, but now I'm more able, and I call it's my purpose about humanizing leadership in organizations.
And that's your purpose, right? That's the mission that you live from.
Yes. Indeed.
So beautiful. How did you bump into that? I mean, people struggle throughout their life, and yet they don't get a glimpse of what they stand for, what they really care for. And I've been pondering on a couple of questions for the last few days, that what really matters in life? Who am I? And how can I live a life from a space of freedom? So these are the three questions that I've been struggling with for last few months. And here you are saying that with so much of clarity. How did you bump into that?
Well, it was definitely not a single moment. That was not a single moment, a collection of moments. But the starting point was when I was actually invited to Oxford at a retreat center, and it was part of a Raja Yoga retreat. And there was this international speaker and leader, Brian Bacon, who's the founder of Oxford Leadership Academy till this day. And this retreat and camp was focused on self-managing leadership, and it was full of self-reflection around the purpose, vision, values, strengths, and calling. And so that was the starting point. It gave me the idea of personal strategic planning. And that's one thing I noticed a lot in my coaching practice, that all these leaders and executives, they know strategic planning so well, like inside out. They can teach it. They've mastered it for the company, for the brand. But when you bring it to the self, so strategic planning for the self, it's not exactly the same thing. So I started practicing that in the 20s, and that become my annual practice. My December, January, my new resolution was not kind of a promise. It was my self retreat, my camp, my half day, 1 day off, where I would get the pen and paper and keep refining year over year, over 10 years, my purpose, vision, values, purpose, vision, values. What did I learn this year? How did that iterate my values? But it did take around 10 years to get it clearer. And still this day, I play with my values, the way I define them. They don't, the core, the essence doesn't change, but how the meaning making of how I would use courage or inspiration, of course, it gets fine tuned on some of the words come in and out based on that year. So the fluidity again.
And I can see a connect when you're talking about your values, how you got introduced to this, and the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What's the connection between values and needs, and how do you look at that?
Yes. Now, just to remind for anyone that's listening, now we most know Maslow with that triangle hierarchy of needs, which, interesting fact, he's not the person who actually designed the triangle himself. He never envisioned that to be in a triangle, which is like a big bomb for those that didn't know that. So, and reading through his work and studying more and more throughout now my PhD as a PhD candidate, I find that the circles as a metaphor, or maybe a ladder going up and down, is a better representation. And the basic needs, the first few levels, are more focused on safety, security, and certainty. So being able to take care of our body physiologically, the body's needs, food and shelter, but also some other security needs to be able to have, that roof, that protection for family and loved ones. Those are kind of some physiological and basic needs. Now, the next two level being belonging and self-esteem. Belonging, being safe and part of a community, and esteem is about cultivating some of the individual skills and acknowledging yourself. It's almost about existing in a way. And those are relational psychological needs. So the first two layers, the basic ones, are more physical. The next two ones are more psychological, relational needs. Yet the top one, which Maslow is kind of the pioneer in humanistic psychology together with Carl Rogers, is self-actualization. So that idea of self-actualization, the more I started understanding it, the more it resonated with the journey I'm on, or the vision I have, or what we need to help leaders understand better. Now, just to clarify, like I use the word self-actualizing rather than self-actualized, rather than the ED past tense, because it's a process. It's an ongoing process. So how it relates, it was really close to understanding what Maslow calls the farther reaches of human nature, and maybe also answering the question. So what is self-actualization? It's about exploring who a human can be. It's about exploring potentialities of who we can be. And as Maslow called it, it's about the farther reaches of human nature. So it's within our potential, but we need to work towards it. It's almost like unlock it.
Yeah. And also, as I'm just listening to you, Timothy, when you spoke about security, survival, or certainty, or a sense of self-esteem, or a sense of belongingness, and as you mentioned, the basic physical needs and psychological needs, and I think it's all about it's all about an individual. And when you're talking about self-actualization, I think you are also referring to going deeper within yourself to identify the talents and the gifts that you've been blessed with, and how you can reach out beyond self, if my understanding is right.
Yes, definitely. And so the journey of self-actualization is unique. What I like about that is that as much as there's some analysis and research now in the last 5 years of giving scientific empirical validity to Maslow's work, the idea that self-actualization, it's not shared, it's quite unique. It's about, and Maslow has a saying, it's not turning a rose into a lily. It's acknowledging that the rose is a rose.
Yeah.
It's a process of finding who we are and explore who we can be.
It's like coming back home.
Yes, indeed. And that taps a little bit into the idea of the B needs and D needs, maybe we can discuss as well.
Yeah. Let me understand. How does the hierarchy of Maslow's needs show up in an organization? Because you do a lot of work in organizations as well, as you spoke about humanizing human potential in organizations. How does that show up in organizations?
Yes, that's one of our biggest questions, and we've been conducting research on that area in the last year. And now the interesting thing is, like again, of course, with deep compassion, I feel for all of us in the world going through this COVID era, and there's been a lot of suffering. On the other side, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is so relevant for the time we're going through as well, both as humanity, but also as organizations trying to survive, thrive, and feed families and feed people and offer services. So it's been really interesting. When we started our journey, like the pandemic was not there, and there we found ourselves in the middle of the pandemic, which shifted our research a little bit. But in a nutshell, so we've been researching with organizations how Maslow's hierarchy of needs show up in employee experience and organizational culture. And it's an ongoing research. It's going to take another 2 years, but we share some of our early findings, and there's some really valuable insights for organizations in terms of how those basic 2 levels of needs show up in organization, in terms of the environment they're offering, the physical safety, the COVID time safety, how are they protecting their employees, and on top of that, the idea of training and onboarding, job descriptions, people knowing what they do, fair compensation and benefits, people be able to take care of their families financially through work, that job stability. Those were a lot of the basic needs showing up.
Precisely.
Now, I think that is quite universal. It's beyond boundaries. Now, the middle part of the hierarchy, though, where belonging and esteem comes up, that's where it gets a little bit tricky, and that's where COVID is kind of changing the dynamics. Of course, not in all industries, but a lot of the industries that are moving into this remote work environment that have that ability. The cultures is shifting in workplaces, and a lot of companies are struggling with the idea of creating belonging in a virtual environment where many people are working from different places. So we have some interesting findings. I actually even have a summary there. I'm going to have a glimpse here. So that it showed up in terms of social connections, inclusion, collaboration, and empowerment.
Becoming more important.
Yes. Learning and development, and appreciation, recognition, celebration. So we had identified like 6, 7 human needs in organizations showing up in this middle part of the hierarchy. But probably the most interesting one is, again, it's how does an organization foster self-actualization? Is that possible? And we find it is possible. And the idea is about the purpose of the organization, how it's embodied or spread. It's about leadership presence and cohesiveness. So that huge role of leadership presence, who they are, how they interact with each other. And another fact, which I'm sure you're going to love, is that leaders appearing as coaches and mentors in their organizations was a factor contributing to a self-actualizing organization. And finally, people-centered policies and practices, so that humanness showing up. But what are your thoughts when you hear about this?
As I'm just listening to you, the image which is appearing in front of me is of spiral dynamics, and how different organizations, different cultures, different nationalities, different families, slowly and steadily they are moving up the levels, and how there's a deep need to move and to start to operate from the level 6, 7, and 8 of spiral dynamics. However, at the same time, I could relate with when you said it's a ladder, it's not a triangle, it's concentric circles, because the assumption that I'm picking up is that could be a possibility that you would be operating from a space of creativity. In your language, you could be operating from a space of sense of belonging or self-esteem. But at a spur of a moment, you might fall down and again start to operate from a basic need of survival. This is what has happened during COVID times, right? There could be a possibility that you have already started to pull yourself up the ladder, and this COVID happened. And suddenly you would have realized yourself at the bottom level, what you call as the D needs of an individual. So is this assumption fine, or would you have another perspective to this?
Oh, that was a perfect summary of it. Exactly. So what COVID made us experience is that we all fell down as humanity to those basic needs, safety and security, which made us like go through a global existential crisis, questioning a lot of things: who we are, what are we doing, are we happy with our works, our lives, are we able to survive and feed our families? There was a lot of deep questioning. And now the funny thing in the internet, there's a lot of popular caricatures and memes these days with actually the base of the hierarchy of needs nowadays is Wi-Fi and internet. And in North America, there's been this weird thing that happened in COVID where people just stocked toilet papers for months, and like there was no toilet papers in this. So like basic needs, going back to that. The joke aside, yes, we did like fall down there. And that's about some deficiency needs. Maybe that's a good clarification. But Maslow talked about 2 types of needs, and we can imagine this as a line, above the line and below the line. So below the line, it's the first 4 levels of that hierarchy of needs, and Maslow calls those as the deficiency needs. We're highly motivated by the lack of those. So the lack of those kind of create craving. So that idea of hunger, and try staying hungry for long times, it changes psychology, it potentially can bring different behaviors that you don't normally show. Or try holding your toilet and not going it for, like, you can hold a couple hours, I don't know how long, but eventually it's like, it's such a need that you can't concentrate on some other levels of needs above those. But there's another type of needs above the line, which are the B needs, the being needs, where it talks about the being values call us. That's the calling part, that inner drive towards self-actualization. The nice thing is Maslow calls the way we need food and shelter and belonging, we need that as well. We have that need, it's inside us, and that's a calling towards something. I think that shows up well in coaching in terms of what's pulling you forward as a force, and what's kind of pulling you not backward, but in a sense, like, yes, there is that, it is a force acting on you, two contradicting forces acting on you, an ability to kind of identify those and work on those.
Yeah, it's actually holding you, right? And not allowing you to move ahead with an inspiration. So either one could be driven by some kind of a fear, as you mentioned, some kind of a lack, or one could be driven by a source of inspiration or a purpose.
Yes, exactly. Now, a nice thing to acknowledge is to not stigmatize deficiency needs. It's that those are really humane. They're not bad. They're not lower in the sense of discrediting them. And actually, one of the ways of moving towards self-actualization is meeting those needs. Now, the watch out is that you can get stuck in a level of need and move in that hedonistic treadmill, like this, like stay in that level and not move forward. That's not what we're encouraging. But the idea is that the ability to progress, if you can have your family under security and safety, if you have, it's not just individual, by the way, there is a whole organizational societal level. If you feel like you have a form of healthcare, if you know that your kids are sick, you can get that health care for them. So that gives you an idea to be able to progress into self-actualization in a more mainstream way. But I know that you know very well that there's that other path of self-transcendence, which we'll talk about as well.
Yeah. So help me understand, since you're talking about moving from D needs to B needs, which is deficiency needs to the being needs, I personally come across people who are stuck at the lack, where they find themselves complete only when they get external validation or when they get external recognition. So their life is driven by external validation, right? By controlling certain behaviors, by proving a point. So what could be done that could allow, let me begin by saying that could allow me to move from the D needs and start to operate from B needs?
So I'm just going to tap into the idea in the adult education realm. One of my favorite theories is transformative learning. Now, it's different than transformational leadership, which compares to transactional leadership. But transformative learning talks about how adults can change their points of view, their paradigms. How do they shift outside of that, almost that consciousness, as we like talking with you? Like, how do they have that jump in consciousness? And in summary, like, let me just summarize in 4 steps. So that learning curve starts with a disorienting dilemma. But what's that dilemma? Now, problems have solutions, but a lot of things in life are dilemmas. Like, they don't have an exact solution. So, but it's disorienting. And that's where we usually start coaching as well. Like, we try to understand that person's dilemmas. It's that contract, that framing, right? And I'm going to jump to number 4, the last one in that, which is actions. And that's kind of the vicious cycle where adults go through. Like, what's the dilemma? Let's move into action. What's the dilemma? Let's move into action. But they're missing this middle component, which is the transformative, the consciousness raising aspect. And that's step 2 is reflection, and step 3 is dialogue. So that middle part, the reflective dialogue, is what increases consciousness and transforms the point of view. And reflection is a point that I really like clarifying. Now, reflection is mostly it's critical thinking, it's headspace, it's cognitive, it's those good questions, those powerful questions. But there's another, I like fine-tuning that contemplation in my knowledge is a deeper way of reflecting. It's not just conscious thinking, it's this whole body being. So it's that deeper reflection. And if we can get people to contemplate about these dilemmas in life and have a dialogue with a coach like yourself, like myself, and then that kind of gives a spark in that consciousness jump as well.
I love the words consciousness jump. I love the word reflective dialogue. Something shifted while I was listening to you. A lot of things fell in place. A lot of things. When you spoke about it's not about taking an action. You use the word distorted dilemma.
Disorienting dilemma, but distorted works
Disorienting.
very well.
Disorienting dilemma and action. Disorienting dilemma, action. Disorienting dilemma, action. What's in between is reflective dialogue. I think that is where the pivoting point is. So thank you so much for bringing that. Let's take one step ahead. In the last conversation, I remember you mentioned that we cannot live with the same principles we have lived in the 20th century. So tell me about that. Why do we need a different set of principles when I personally believe principles are timeless, they are universal? So why do we need a different set of principles?
Well, within your statement, of course, there's a very well-intended assumption that all principles are same. So maybe let's distinguish with that I don't think all principles are same. A principle for me, if it's universal, should be a principle. But what some people see as principles, and in our definition, maybe that's not a principle. I think in the 20th century, humanity has done a lot of things that looks like principles, but that are not. And what I mean by that is the very basic ethical idea of harm, like creating harm and no harm. Like a principle, if it's universal, it should be based on some of this. This is a big philosophical debate, but some ethics around no harm, right? And I don't think we lived the 20th century with that philosophy. I think we created a lot of harm. And yes, there is suffering in life. It is part of maybe existence, but I think we've a little bit overdone it. And now we're facing some of those consequences in terms of environmental challenges, those global warming and the consequences, which genuinely worry me about my son's future. I genuinely feel, and as a person that feels quite interconnected, that the self, like I am part of the world. I am part of this ecosystem, like one of the cells in the body, almost knowing that I am part of this whole body. Like, yes, I'm a cell as an identity, but I'm also the whole body. I am part of this whole body. I'm part of this world, and I'm concerned. And a lot of this is coming from the softwares of the mind of humanity. We've seen in the showing of polarization of the world as well. So just connecting to your question, we cannot operate in the type of principles that were used in the 20th century. And I know that I want to be part of the solution. I have some very good, my master's was in education. I did an MED, which I got to meet phenomenal teachers. It was one of the moments I felt hope in my life that these teacher friends, the way they're trying to challenge the educational system, how they envision the next generation, how helping the next generation to be more aware and connected. Like I felt energy from my teacher colleagues. My space as an adult educator is working with adults and leaders. I see my role that in the coming 10 to 30 years, like I'm going to work on the leaders of the world, people in power, with the Maslow Center to influence this shift. And I hope my teacher friends, colleagues, meanwhile, will be planting seeds for the next generation. So.
Absolutely. In fact, that's one question that I've kept it for a little later. Since we are talking about principles, since we are talking about 21st century, since we are talking about the next generation, so let's try and understand. Would love to hear from you. What does it mean to be self-actualized in the 21st century?
Good question. Now, within this environment of global polarization, environmental challenges, and this digital transformation happening, it's about exploring our common humanness. Right? It's about exploring what differentiates human beings from machines, artificial intelligence, and acknowledging and playing in that field of humanness, which is, yeah, it's a lot of the things that the machines cannot do. And machines will at some point, yes, I believe in that coexistence will happen, but It's about the compassion, the cultivation of the compassion, awareness, and consciousness. And it's about connections, us acknowledging that we're cells, we're organs of a whole body working together. So it's understanding that in this realm of technology and connecting to each other. But I would summarize that it's that interconnectedness. So I think that how are we going to acknowledge our interconnectedness? And if not, we're going to face the consequences.
Yeah. I will also pick up one more thing that you said, that finding the humanness in each other. And as you mentioned, interconnectedness, letting go of the separatedness that we are operating from. So thank you so much for this great learning, Timothy. So you also spoke about finding your gifts, finding your talents. You also spoke about identity as the self, and identity as a part of the bigger self. So what are the ways that could help people identify, discover their talents, their gifts?
Well, now, what one thing that Maslow found about self-actualizing people is that they experience they have peak experiences, and these peak experiences are, in a sense, glimpses of a higher level of consciousness. It's a peek through that floor and then maybe coming back. And there are definitely some similarities and threads in terms of whether this was a religious practice or a philosophical or a nature-based practice. But I find the common word to be, there was a sense of contemplation in them. So the peak experiences are one of the ways where people get a glimpse. Now I have just one more story. I remember I graduated from university and I went to visit one of my friends that were studying in south of France at Nice, which is a beautiful place in the Mediterranean. But he was living a very different lifestyle with his it was really, maybe that was a typical one. I wasn't the typical one. So a lot of party lives and etc. Where I was a little bit more interested in the nature and in the sea. So I just decided, like, during the daytimes I would go at that beach at the Nice, and it's actually a little bit of a crowded beach, but I sat down. I had this one day where I sat down at that beach on the rocks. And I sat there for 7 hours. I don't know why I sat down for 7 hours without going to the washroom. Don't ask me. But I was watching the sea, and I had this again deep moments, conversations with myself. And what am I doing? Like, I graduated from engineering. I don't want to be an engineer. Who am I? What's happening? But hours and hours, and after a moment, the stillness and silence, and that was one of the moments where I just grabbed a pen and paper from my backpack and I started designing a course. And I saw myself as a teacher. I don't have a teacher in my family. No one told me I should be a teacher. But I didn't know about this need of this teacher archetype. Like, that's my nature. I love teaching, learning and teaching. Those peak experiences are great moments and opportunities. It's the idea of the flow, like finding your flow. And those finding strengths, again, maybe a more popular and easy word, like acknowledging and finding your strengths and playing on them. But it's a process. For sure.
Yeah. I can relate with that 200%. There are times when I'm sitting at the seashore talking to myself, watching the waves striking the rocks and going back. And in those moments, those waves do whisper something in my ears. I remember me sitting at Mount Bonnell, one of the hills in Austin, the US, talking to myself, watching the sunset as the sunset changes different shades, the blue and the orange and the yellow and the red. And I'm talking to myself that what's the message the sunset has got to tell me? And so I can connect with when you're talking about the peak experiences. Now, how can I invite more such peak experiences in my life, and how could I actually walk this path?
Well, that reminds me of the story, which you might know of the Zen master and his student. So this excited student comes and asks the Zen master, so master, if I meditate 4 hours a day, how soon will I get enlightened? And the Zen master says, you'll get there in 10 years. And then the student says, well, what if I meditate for 8 hours a day? How fast will I get there? And the Zen master says, you will get there in 20 years. And the students like confused, but I'll be meditating more. Like, why would it take more time? And so then Zen master doesn't even answer. So it led him to figure it out. So in terms of, it's a really nice question, that is this about more, like doing more, or is this about finding those moments and maybe like what I experienced in myself, and I'm curious to hear about your experience as well in my meditation practice in those younger years. When I started having these peak experiences, you get in a sense a little bit attached to that as well. Like you chase, it's almost like maybe chasing a high head or getting like you want to get that hit, but then you stop having those, so you get in this circle. Then why is it not, it's not working, my meditation is not working. So you fall in this trap of, is it working, not working? And then you just let go. Maybe you fall away from it for some times, and it's been a couple of months, year, and then you go back to it with no expectation, and then it's again, it's happening. Yeah. So that's a good reminder for us that we all have our own ladder, as you said, the ladder, like it's up and down. It's the times of the year. And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I can relate with that, because it's not about chasing. And the more I'm getting into this rigmarole of chasing, the more I'm moving away from the very essence of meditation, because I personally feel the essence of meditation is not to get attached to anything. And if I'm getting attached to that one experience that I would like to create for myself, I'm actually moving in the other direction, expecting that I would reach where I want to reach.
Now, one thing I have to admit is that since I got married and become a father, a parent, a spouse, like in some senses, I feel like my knowledge and wisdom is increasing, but in some other areas, the roles of lives is also maybe the D needs sometimes pulling me backwards. So in some senses, I feel like I progressed, but in some other areas, I feel like I regressed compared to 10 years ago. So it's really interesting, all those facets and roles in life.
Yeah, and that's the reason why we call it a journey.
Indeed.
At times you take 3 steps ahead, and before you realize, you've taken 2 steps backwards. So Timothy, help me understand, how can we create more leaders for the world who are self-actualized, or who are on their journey for the self-actualization?
Very good. Yes. Well, I think that, again, speaking of principles, I think a good principle that came out from 2000 years ago is know thyself. So how do we get these leaders to know themselves? It's that piece of reflection and contemplation. So how can we offer, as coaches, consultants, trainers in these different areas of human development, how can we get leaders to truly reflect, genuinely reflect about who they are, what they're doing, how they relate to other human beings? So how do we bring in more of that reflection? And how do we cultivate lifelong learning? So I think that reflection, lifelong learning, the reflective dialogues, how can we bring more of those into leadership development? And a nice thing to acknowledge is that in the leadership field, there's kind of 2 branches, the leadership theory and leadership development. The leadership theorists keep looking for that magical leadership model. Let's do analysis, let's define. And if you look in the literature, for every letter in the alphabet, let's start with A, authentic leadership, brave leadership, creative consciousness leadership, like all the letters have leadership models. And they keep repackaging, bundling a set of 20 values, virtues under different categorizations based on the regression analysis. And now we have another one. Let's put the Tiryaki leadership. This is how we define it. So that's not my intention. I don't think we need, and I don't think having one magical leadership model is going to unlock it. It's the second field, which is the leadership development field, which is the process, the developmental process of how can we grow the leaders in the experience. It's the experiential learning, which coaching is part of it as well. So I genuinely believe if we have great coaches, really well-trained coaches that can influence leaders, that creates a great space for leaders. And I believe in coaching because the 1-day retreat, the 2-day leadership camp, it's a lovely opportunity to connect, but not always is transformative. Whereas when they work with a coach over the 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, like those, they need to eventually break down and start reflecting. So that's why I'm really hopeful and supportive that the path forward is that as coaches, leadership coaches, that we need to help leaders go through that reflection, contemplation. And yes, so for me, the summary, it's about service and practice. So how do we serve and how do we practice ourselves?
Yeah. And I loved the word that you use. It's all about experiencing, right? It's like getting into the reflective dialogue, as you use the word, and then experimenting that, embodying those practices that we have been talking about. Now, Timothy, what are you doing to build your influence today in the world as a leadership development coach, the kind of transformational work that you are involved in?
Yes, well, thank you for asking that, because the now this whole vision has turned into reality on what I'm doing through a center we established last year, Maslow Center for Executive Leadership. So in this center, we're again, we're researching Maslow's work, how it connects to humanity in the 21st century in this COVID era, mostly from an organizational lens. And the programs we offer, the systematic corporate coaching we offer, it's fueling. And I think we're all on that path. You and I, we discussed that, like we're on that same path of helping humanity move towards somewhere. And I believe there's no shortage of opportunities. There's a lot of organizations and leaders that need the support. So through Maslow Center and revisiting, reigniting Maslow's work in the 21st century, we want to bring back self-actualization in the language of organizations and encourage that they work towards self-actualization. It is possible.
Thank you. With this, we are coming to an end of this conversation. Amazing nuggets I could pick up, starting from the journey with which you got initiated into the space of leadership development. And before that, you got initiated in the space of meditation and yoga, and then leadership development, and then how Intel happened, and then coaching happened, and then your journey and self exploration. And as you use the word, reflective dialogue with yourself to become the person that you've become. So, with all the wisdom that you've been able to accumulate for yourself, Timothy, what do you know for sure with 100% certainty and surety?
You left the biggest bomb question to the end, Gaurav. So, because I'm not sure if I know something with that amount of precision and certainty, but I think I would say that, oh yes, there I have the answer. That life is a teaching. Life is a teaching and a teacher. And those that don't learn suffer more. And those that learn suffer less. So I think seeing life as the teaching, the teacher is the best we can do on this journey, and try passing our life exams so we don't have to repeat them.
Beautiful. Those who don't learn, they suffer, and who learn, they don't suffer. I think they really enjoy their life as they go through the journey called life. So, Timothy, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your wisdom. Such a pleasure talking to you once again, and looking
Thank
forward
you
to
so
more
much, Gaurav.
such conversations.
My pleasure. The space you hold, your presence is what inspires us as well. So I love your podcast and all of your recordings. I look forward to following them as well.
Thank you so much for your kind words, generosity, and the kindness with which you held the space. So, thank you so much.